Yes, of course.
Yeah, I'm going on the air.
Yes, hello, this is Dave with a mic check. Hello, hello. Hi, everyone.
Test 1 2, test 1 2. Good afternoon. We're coming on the air this afternoon to bring you complete coverage of Bishop Richard Malone's news conference with the Buffalo media.
And this news conference was announced late last week amid a scandal of priest abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo. And just this weekend, 2 more priests were placed on leave as the list of accused priests continues to grow.
In a statement Saturday, the diocese said allegations of abuse have been levied against Father Ronald Sajak and Monsignor Fred Lysing. Both have connections to Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church in Clarence. Now, according to the Western New York Catholic website, Sajak took over as head pastor of the parish after Monsignor Lysing retired back in 2015. He had served at that parish for 12 years. The diocese is now investigating the claims against Sajak and Lysing.
And before meeting with the media at 2:30 this afternoon, in just about 29 minutes, Bishop Malone is talking with priests themselves. That meeting is underway right now at the Infant of Prague, that's in Cheektowaga. It began at 1 o'clock today. We're going to hear from the bishop himself coming up at 2:30. Questions about what their conversation will certainly be asked during his news conference.
Which is also happening inside the Infant of Prague. 2 on Your Side has multiple crews there today to bring you this story. 2 on Your Side's Dave McKinley is outside the church right now. And Dave, are priests still inside for their meeting with the bishop, or have you seen them start to leave?
Well, most are, Mary Alice. We saw one leave. We believe he was at the meeting. The rest, we might, even during our report here, start to see some of the priests who came here at this meeting today start to file out. But just to set the scene for you, it was about an hour before the meeting started with Bishop Malone that we saw the first of the parish priests arrive here, a steady stream of them, dozens and dozens over time. And to greet them here, we'll show you just down from me, there is a small group of, well, to call them demonstrators wouldn't be the proper nomenclature. Let's just call them members of the faith. Less than a dozen or so, carrying signs and also saying to the priests as they made their way into the meeting with the bishop, calling out to them, saying to the various fathers, we love you, we appreciate your vocation. I spoke to some of them as to what their purpose was here and what they meant by their words of encouragement to the priests. Well, they told me that they wanted to let the priests know that they do love them, that they understand that the priests are in a tough position right now. And these are trying times for the church and the vocation of priests, whose reputations perhaps have been soiled by the alleged actions of a few. They said they wanted them to know that they're there for them and that they're praying for them, and to let them know not to be pressured into capitulating to what the bishop might tell them, saying that they have to stay true to their hearts and remember that they are as much responsible, if not more so, of protecting their flock than the bishop is as the leader of the entire flock. Heading into that meeting today, we did hear from one of the priests who stopped to talk to assembled reporters.
It's been incredibly demoralizing. I can't even begin to tell you the emotions that I feel when news breaks and breaks and breaks. And thank God for you to help bring the truth forward and to make sure that our church leaders are good and holy and doing the right thing always.
Father, for the few that are accused, there are countless more who have taken their vows and their vocation very seriously. Is there still a sense of confidence among the men of the clergy that the congregation recognizes this?
Yeah, you know, I've only had good experiences with the people in the pews. They've been so merciful, so understanding, and so respectful, you know, and so we're doing the best we can to be good and holy, really and truly, I think.
What characteristics would you like to see, maybe that you're not seeing in the bishop right now, that you'd like to see change? What changes would you like to see when you talk about the leadership of the diocese?
You know, I really do love and respect our bishop very, very much. I think he is doing the best he can. You know, of course, he's admitted to those mistakes, and I'm confident that he's not going to make those mistakes again. So I think what he's doing now is the best he can, and we'll see how the people, the Catholics, faithful, feel about that.
Were you given a firm inkling of what he would say to you going in here today?
No, actually, he just wanted us to show up, and there's been rumors about what he would say, but I don't like to spread those, of course. But no, not really. But I got to go. I think the meeting's starting.
Your name, please.
All right, and so there you hear from one priest from Our Lady of Victory Parish in Lackawanna talking about his anticipated feelings going into the meeting with the bishop. Now, we kind of staked out a position here on the sidewalk that might lend itself to talking to some of the priests as they exit, because we're between the door they came in and the cars they parked in a parking lot. Among the cadre of folks down here, the faithful, if you will, that I had referenced earlier in our report, I do need to tell you there are more than a couple of them there, though, that were hoping that the bishop would announce his resignation. We didn't hear from anybody who expected that to happen today. However, I just wanted to tell you there are some down here who feel that Bishop Malone, that the best thing he could do for now is to leave the Buffalo Diocese. So again, we'll stand by here and we'll see if any of the priests who exit the meeting with the bishop today do have some thoughts to share about what went on in there before the actual news conference itself, which is scheduled to begin at 2:30. My colleague Steve Brown will be covering that, and I would imagine at that point that the bishop will be asked what his message to the priests was today. Guys.
All right, Dave McKinley, live today. Dave, stand by. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, yesterday I had a chance to speak at length with Bishop Malone about the priest scandal, and our conversation lasted 40 minutes, and we discussed many things like his handling of the priest abuse allegation reports and what he says to people who no longer think he's capable of leading the diocese. While I am a lifelong practicing Catholic and still belong to my home parish in North Tonawanda, it is important to note for you that I have never served on any of the bishop's lay advisory councils. Here now is some of our conversation. Let's move on to that list of 42 priests that you released in the spring, Bishop. 25 of those priests were dead. And on the release, it said that deceased priests with more than one accusation were included.
Right.
Why weren't deceased priests with one accusation included?
Well,
is that not serious enough?
Well, it could be, but it's a prudential judgment we made out of justice and fairness to a deceased priest who can't respond, who cannot.
But he's dead, Bishop, and the victims are not in most cases.
But there is justice owed to him and to his family. So our thought was, now it's arguable, there's no question about it. Our thought was that if in fact there are two of them, that's a pretty good piece of evidence that something happened. With one, it might not be a valid complaint.
Let me ask you about a full and complete list. I believe Siobhan O'Connor said that may include as many as 118 priests. What is the real number?
Well, we're working on an updated list practically even as we speak. You'll be hearing about that very, very soon. So, the reason why there were 42 were those were the names at that time that we knew for sure were substantiated.
With that much higher standard?
That were either admitted or proven, okay? Others were left off because they were members of religious orders who are primarily accountable to their own provincial superior, different things like that.
Sure.
But you'll be seeing a new list fairly soon.
Will that new list include sexual misconduct for those including minors and adults? That
All those
complete full list?
All those things are being looked at right now.
But you don't want to commit to it being a full list?
Well, it's a very fluid thing, getting this together. I'm not in charge of it. Someone else on my staff is responsible for that. But it's going to be as full and open and transparent as we can possibly make it.
How much money does the diocese have to
people
pay?
ask me that all the time, and we're not sure because we don't know what how will I call it? What will be the range or the spectrum of payments for the compensation? Because there'll of course be a range of egregiousness. All abuse is horrific and sinful and criminal.
Is that amount based on what your insurance will cover plus assets of the diocese?
Well, we hope that insurance covers some of it. We also are counting on some of our reserves the diocese has. Also, we'll be selling property. I just moved from Oakland Place this past week to St. Stan's Convent over on the east side. So that house is up for sale.
Other dioceses have done similar things.
Correct.
Is that a guide for you in any way for
Correct.
what
Correct.
you may do?
All the New York dioceses have some version of this compensation program.
That's right. Is bankruptcy of the Buffalo Diocese a concern of yours?
It is a possibility. We're hoping and praying we don't get there because we need the funds to do the good work of the church.
Bishop, let's move on to the 60 Minutes report. I just have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Part of your response after the report aired was to release some of Siobhan O'Connor's notes and letters and emails that she had written praising you. If you weren't trying to discredit her, what was the purpose for releasing those?
And I can totally understand why you and others would ask that question. And I can promise you it wasn't to be vindictive. I just wanted to put out there an indication of the Siobhan O'Connor that I knew and was very fond of.
She said she was very fond of you as well.
And we worked, she was the best executive assistant I've ever had. And I was kind of astonished by this whole thing that came all of a sudden, you know. But I just thought it would be a good thing for people to see there's another side to her.
What is the other side do you think that shows? What did those emails represent to you?
Loyalty, the ones that she sent to me.
Well, the ones that you published.
Yes,
what did that
and there were
say
many more than those. Oftentimes she told me that I was the best boss she'd ever had. And she loved working with me, and I loved working with her. We had a wonderful bond. We could work well together. We could laugh, and
so did you
she was excellent.
What role does that play in the scandal? What message were you trying to send? Were you trying to tell the public that she had a love for her faith and her bishop, or are you trying to imply there was some sort of conflict, or she was somehow two-faced?
I would never say she was two-faced. Knowing Siobhan as well as I do, I'm convinced that she was acting out of her conscience in what she did. And that's all I can say about that.
There are some priests who openly have called for you to resign. Father Paul Seil said so in an interview. I want to play his soundbite and let you respond.
This culture of evil, you know, has been perpetuated long before Bishop Malone. We're finding out now it was perpetuated secretly long before Bishop Malone arrived here.
Do you believe he can be effective any longer?
No, I do not believe he can be effective as a bishop any longer.
How do you respond to them that you still have the moral authority to lead this diocese?
Well, I'm going to ask them to be honest with me.
There'll be an opportunity for you to have discourse. Will some of them be allowed to speak?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely, they always are. And I'll be meeting with representatives of the priests again on Tuesday at a private meeting. And we'll talk it all through.
Do you feel that your credibility has been damaged irreparably?
I hope not. I hope not.
And how do you gauge that? How do you know when you've lost the flock? Because I know there are some people who do support you. I'll be honest, Bishop, I haven't had many of them come forward to me, but there are so many calls now, priests who are sending letters asking for your resignation, but who holds you accountable other than the Holy Father in Rome, 3,000 miles away with the weight of the world on his shoulders?
Well, one of the things that the U.S. bishops will be dealing with when we meet in Baltimore in next week, the week after, starting a week from tomorrow actually, will be how do we hold one another accountable as brother bishops. Mm-hmm. The worst case scenario is how do we hold accountable a bishop himself who has abused. That's the worst case, obviously, like the McCarrick situation. But the other area they're going to be looking at is when it seems a bishop has not handled cases adequately. There needs to be some kind of a structure or process that we will follow.
You would be agreeable to that?
I support that, absolutely.
But I think some people want you to perhaps recognize that too many mistakes have been made, that too many people have been hurt or brushed aside, and that too much damage is done, that our faithful have lost confidence in you to be able to truly institute zero tolerance, and that you're really committed to rooting out that evil that Father Seil talked about.
I will again apologize for the mistakes I made with Father Yetter and Father Smith with adult complaints about adult misconduct. I believe my record with handling allegations of abuse of children is perfect. We have, every single year, we go through an external audit, compliance audit with the Dallas Charter, and every year we get a 100% clean audit that we're doing it all right. So what can I say?
I think what parishioners have said to me is that after they've seen these documents, Bishop, is that what they see is what they see politically when we're talking about a cover-up and a conspiracy. That's what it looks like to them. They say what you are characterizing as mistakes were really calculated choices that were made to allow priests to stay in ministry, to not be protecting all the faithful, mincing words or just saying that children only needed protection. Doesn't all that documentation show that when you look at those documents?
Well, as I've said many times, Mary Alice, signing off on Father Smith's request to go as a chaplain on a cruise ship was a bad mistake on my part.
Because there were lots of allegations that he was someone who abused parishioners.
His
children.
Well, that didn't come till March of this year. As soon as an allegation of sexual abuse of a child came to us this March, immediately he was put on administrative leave. It was investigated. It was found substantiated. And that case is one of the ones being prepared to go to the Vatican now. So when it is child abuse, and we have to have, that's what I'm saying, a stronger way of dealing with these things when it involves adults.
How many mistakes, Bishop, should you be allowed to make before you recognize irreparable damage has been done?
Well, the scripture says forgive 70 times, 7 times. So I can only go, I don't want that, I'm not asking that much. But I
you think parishioners and your brother priests will be that tolerant?
I hope people believe enough in the Richard Malone they've come to know, if they've come to know me, to know that I am sincere in my admission of failure in those cases. I feel I have been handling the rest of the work well, not perfectly, and I just hope I'll be given a chance to finish it.
Well, there you have it, and if you would like to watch more of my interview with Bishop Malone, we have the entire 40-minute conversation posted for you on our website and the WGRZ app. We went into actually many topics talking about also the handling of suspensions of priests. What is that process exactly? Some priests have told me that they're in limbo, that there really isn't a protocol being followed, and there is one. It does exist, and it has not been. So there are grave concerns on many different fronts.
It'll be interesting to see when it starts this news conference at 2:30, which we're going to be covering live for you as well. But right now, coming up in just a moment, local attorneys Mike Tahiri and Barry Covert, they are going to join us live in studio to discuss this scandal, what we heard from Bishop Malone just now, and what we expect to hear coming up in just a little bit this afternoon. We're back in a moment. Okay, welcome back. For a unique perspective right now, we're going to be joined by some local defense attorneys, Mike Tahiri and Barry Covert. Let's start with you, Barry. We want to let the viewers know that you do represent an alleged victim of this church sexual abuse. Barry and Mike, first and foremost, your overall reaction to Mary Alice's interview with the bishop yesterday. She spent about 40 minutes with him, peppering him with a lot of questions. What was your overall feeling of that interview?
I thought it was really kind of shocking, which I didn't think I would be able to feel that as an emotion afterwards. I really thought that based upon the multiple interviews that he's been granting over the last few days, the incredible access that he was being given through Mary Alice's interview, that he would use that as an opportunity to really change the direction of the ship, turn things around, and go forward in a transparent fashion. Instead, despite the great questions that Mary Alice asked him, he never gave any information. He didn't want to say who was going to be on the list, what the criteria were going to be on the abusive priest lists. He didn't want to disclose how much money would be in the fund for the abuse victims. Mary Alice repeatedly tried to pin him down, was very kind and very firm in how she did so, and he declined at every opportunity to give that information. He seemed to be confused as to whether a 15 or 16-year-old, when he was discussing my client, was a minor. I almost fell off my chair when I initially saw that, and every time I see it, it's difficult to understand, again, his responses. You would think that he's now got every opportunity to figure out what the response should be to every question. These questions have now been asked for months and months by media, by commentators, by lawyers, I assume by people in his own administration. So he really should have good answers. And he had many opportunities to really take the right path and go the right way in the answers. When he's talking about the whistleblower, Miss O'Connor, who did a wonderful job, and Mary Alice asked him about the press release where he appeared to try to intimidate her, to embarrass her, and he denied it. And he said, oh, I'm just giving this for background information about her. I want people to know what her and my relationship was. No, this press release, which presumably was drafted and reviewed by multiple people and himself, said that it wanted to release these emails to show that her current comments were contradictory and embarrassing.
Well, Barry, I understand that you represent a victim and you're currently in process of communicating with the diocese, and I understand there's not a lot of communication going back and forth, and that's not that unusual, but I want to turn to Mike quickly because, Mike, you represent a priest who has been accused of abuse, so we've got the other side of the spectrum here, and I heard from a lot of parishioners who are concerned when they lose their parish priest about what that process is and how quickly it might move so that they can be vindicated. What has happened with your client and others that you know of once they've been put on suspension by the bishop?
Well, that's an excellent question because, frankly, nobody knows this process. The bishop has provided this booklet, this diocesan review booklet that supposedly sets forth the rules that the diocese review board is supposed to comply with. And frankly, today is November 5th. My client, Father Sam Vinay, was suspended in April. We still have not received a copy of the charges that were filed against him. And frankly, that's in the manual that they provide. Father Vinay did not get a lawyer provided by the diocese. We are never given an opportunity to appear before this review board and present our case. This is a person who's been a priest for over 40 years and was never given, frankly, Bishop Malone has never even called Father Vinay since he was suspended to say, how are you doing? He's treated these priests like lepers since they've actually been placed on administrative leave. And it is absolutely shameful. And I just want to build on Mr. Covert's response here. The one part, how can you not know how many priests are on that list? There could be nothing more important going on in the Diocese of Buffalo right now than to know who these alleged pedophiles are, who's involved, and to come on and say, I still don't know how many are on the list is frankly disappointing, shameful, and disingenuous. And it certainly shouldn't instill any confidence in the priests or any of the parishioners.
Barry, let me ask you a question. Just a few moments ago, when Dave McKinley was outside there, we heard one of the priests say that they believe that Bishop Malone is doing the best that he can. How do you react to that priest that said that he thinks Bishop Malone is doing the best that he can?
I think that it's a priest that probably has a lot of pressure, and while he wants to be proactive, he also knows that Bishop Malone is ultimately his boss. It's hard to imagine that anyone thinks that Bishop Malone is doing the best he can. He has now had months or years. He has prior experience in Massachusetts dealing with these. He has been given plenty of time to determine who all the abusive priests are and to disclose that list. To take all of the files, no matter how old the allegations are, hand them over to the DA's office, the Attorney General's office, the U.S. Attorney's office without a subpoena, because he should be on a higher moral level. To set procedures in place to make certain that not only past abuse victims are properly compensated, but that we don't have future victims. I understand and I sympathize with the priests that are currently serving Bishop Malone, but it's hard to understand anyone claiming that he is doing the best he can.
Mike, I want to ask you and let our audience know, too, that you are also a practicing Catholic. I know that you also do a lot of service at St. Luke's Mission of Mercy. I want to ask you, though, throughout this process that you've gone through, first of all, do you know the priests, are there any financial support given as far as hiring attorneys to help them through this process?
We have assembled a legal defense team, and frankly, we have not received a penny. It is a privilege to represent a priest. All the priests that I've consulted with, Father Sam Vinay, I have not charged a penny. So how can the bishop say, gee, I don't know how much I'm paying my law firm? Well, he's a steward of the assets that we put in as parishioners every Sunday. And frankly, that was very disappointing. He should know. He's responsible. So that is part of his management, is to be able to answer those questions regarding the legal fees. This compensation review board, frankly, since it was put in place, and I've spoken to other plaintiffs' lawyers, they haven't paid a penny.
Right.
The priests that have been suspended, we are in total limbo. I've never received a piece of paper from the diocese that said, here's the next step in the process. Mm-hmm. So this process is no process, and it is an absolute shameful way to treat a priest who's been, called to his vocation 30 and 40 years.
Well, Mike, it is shocking to hear because, as we all know, justice delayed is justice denied, and I think the assumption was made by parishioners like you, like myself, throughout the diocese that there was at least a fair process being followed for our priests. Mike and Barry, thank you very much. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after these brief messages.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know.
And welcome back to our special coverage today. We're now just minutes away from Bishop Richard Malone's news conference at Infant of Prague Church in Cheektowaga. And 2 on your side, Steve Brown is inside this afternoon preparing his questions for the bishop. And Steve, what do you think we are going to hear from him today?
Well, it could be a lot of questions from a lot of different media outlets because the bishop has been something on a charm offensive, if you will, in regards to the crisis in his own diocese. He's been doing individual interviews with separate outlets, one television station at first, then 30 minutes with WBEN on Friday, and then a couple of interviews yesterday, both the Buffalo News and, of course, with Mary Alice in studio yesterday afternoon. Today will be an opportunity, a first opportunity, for a number of media outlets to start asking questions because the bishop has not made himself very available over the course of the last weeks and months as this crisis in his diocese has deepened, widened, and gotten more intense. There have been calls for his resignation, both outside of clergy and within the ranks of clergy, elected leaders as well. He has indicated so far that he has no intention of leaving his post, that he's not going to leave his flock, if you will, and he made that very clear again with Mary Alice's interview yesterday. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say coming from the gathering that he will be leaving, which is a gathering of priests and deacons behind closed doors, presumably, where they can speak frankly about the current situation and presumably where the bishop can get them up to speed as to where the diocese is in reconciling these cases, both new and old, where they are in regards to answering difficult questions, not the least of which is, are there 8 or 9 priests that should have been taken out of the priesthood still in service here in the diocese in some way, in some fashion. Another thing that we're possibly looking for is that expanded list. The bishop said yesterday to Mary Alice that a new expanded list of priests who have offended, who have been accused credibly of abuse would be coming forward. That list was originally at 42. We know that number is much longer than that because there have been a number that have been placed on administrative leave under various different circumstances. We've been led to believe by reports both nationally and locally that that number could be as high as 118. So it'll be interesting to see if that list comes forward, because we were told yesterday, Mary Alice told yesterday that that list would be coming out very soon. A lot of questions also about what this is going to cost the diocese, and this is kind of front of mind for a lot of folks in the parishes on Sunday, as to how much this is going to cost and where that money is going to come from. Yesterday, the bishop disclosed that he didn't really have a budget number top of mind about how much this was going to cost, and it has cost various dioceses millions of dollars, obviously. And now he's also, stated yesterday that the fact that bankruptcy is an actual possibility for this diocese is certainly concerning, and one of the questions that certainly I want to get to right off the bat, because that means a lot of different things, especially for folks potentially who rely on the diocese for all sorts of services. Keep in mind, these were the social service providers before social service agencies and governments existed. So there's a long list, and there's a room full of very eager reporters here trying to, going to be eagerly waiting their turn to get questions in. So we probably will hear any and all of that.
Steve?
Back to you.
Yeah, Steve,
Yes.
I know that you've had some conversations with some of the journalists from the Boston Globe, the newspaper that broke the story in Boston of the priest sex abuse scandal there that really reverberated nationally. What is some of the feedback that you have gotten from those journalists when they were dealing with the diocese, who was slow to disclose the depth and the breadth of the priest abuse scandal in their community?
Well, in Boston, it was that diocese's ability to completely keep everything secret for such a long period of time. And in your interview yesterday, Mary Alice, the bishop essentially disclosed that, yes, in fact, the old way of doing things was to keep as much out of the newspapers and off of television screens as possible, and that Bishop Malone said that he was working to try and be more forthcoming. That said, there have been instances which call into question whether or not he's actually living up to that promise made just as recently as yesterday, because there have been instances where people have been recently, this past weekend, placed on administrative leave where claims were known to the diocese against them for 23 years. So it is not a mess entirely, if you will, of Bishop Malone's own making, but that openness has not existed, and those are the parallels here in Boston. I'm in fairly regular contact with Mike Resendiz, who is one of the reporters with the Spotlight Unit who broke that story out in Boston, and that was the biggest thing. That was the biggest challenge, is getting people to break ranks, both clergy and, quite frankly, the legal community that supported them out there, in order to be able to tell that story. And essentially they were, but it required an extraordinary amount of effort there, as it has here. And we really don't know the extent of this yet, even though we're to understand that some of these claims might go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even before all of that. And to be fair, Bishop Malone was not here in Buffalo during all of that. But he does carry the burden of being the bishop now. He does carry the burden of trying to resolve these cases and trying to bring about a resolution that is fair to the victims and mindful of the financial strain that it's going to be placed on the diocese. We still don't really know how much that's going to be.
And we want to let everybody know that that point that you make is very valid, and we did in the interview as well acknowledge that many of these abuse cases took place long before Richard Malone came to Buffalo, but at the same time he was presented with that 300-page dossier when he arrived, with every single case that was pending, that they had documentation. So it also is not accurate to say he did not have knowledge of those cases.
Correct. And Steve, let me ask you this too. You say there's been some breaking of ranks when it happened in Boston. It's also begun already here in Buffalo with Deacon Snyder and different priests that have been speaking out recently, the breaking of the ranks. You mentioned bankruptcy and that it could be a possibility. It would not be the first time if, in fact, that did happen, correct?
No, not at all. It hasn't happened recently, but I was doing some quick research this morning. There's a couple of dioceses in Minnesota, the biggest one, which is Minneapolis-St. Paul, and then Duluth, both in 2015, both filed for bankruptcy, largely because what they, hang on a second. 10 to 15 minutes, but they will, when we start, okay. We are told that there's going to be a 10 to 15 minute delay in the bishop arriving, so essentially we're looking at something between 2:40 and 2:45 before this all kicks off. To get back to your point, Scott, those two dioceses did file for bankruptcy, and some large dioceses have. Milwaukee has filed for bankruptcy. Wilmington, North Carolina has filed for bankruptcy. So there have been some dioceses that have done it. And there is some concern amongst advocates for victims. The group SNAP is very concerned that this sort of thing would essentially diminish what financial compensation might come to these folks that are filing claims that may have lawsuits, but also that it may tamp down other people from coming forward, because there is a fear that somehow if compensation is what they're looking for, and in my mind that's certainly within the realm of possibility. If that's what they want, that's what they should be going after, that they won't come forward because they won't get it, or may not get it. So there's a lot of concern about those sorts of things, but as the bishop said yesterday, that's a possibility. We just don't know how strong a possibility it is.
Thank you, Steve. And we have two defense attorneys in studio who can give us a little bit more insight on that issue when we come back.
That's right. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to our special report today. This is a live picture. This is Infant of Prague in Cheektowaga right now, where our camera crews are out there. Our Steve Brown and Dave McKinley are out there. We're waiting for Bishop Malone to finish his meeting with the priests. We are waiting for the priests to leave also. They have not yet. So it has been a little over an hour and a half so far that they have been in that meeting. We are still awaiting to hear from the bishop himself to take questions from the media that is assembled there as well.
And we can only begin to imagine what the conversation is like in that room. The bishop told me yesterday that he will be speaking, but he will also be giving his brother priests an opportunity to talk to him. And he said he was open to listening to what they had to say. So we'll have more on that, of course, when the priests begin to leave. But right now we want to go back to Barry Covert and Mike Tahiri, two defense attorneys who are here. Barry is representing an alleged abuse victim, and Mike is representing a priest who's been accused of abuse, though the two cases are not connected. But we were talking a minute ago with Steve Brown about compensation, and there is a compensation board that the diocese has put together who will review cases and then presumably make payments to victims. But there's also an opportunity for victims to sue civilly. Barry, in your case, for example, your client is not able to sue civilly because the statute of limitations based on the law has already passed, correct?
That's correct. And as Bishop Malone stated to you when you interviewed him, the Catholic Church is spending money, parishioners' money, lobbying money, to prevent our legislature from passing legislation that opens up a window of time for victims of abuse that are currently outside the statute of limitations to bring those lawsuits. Other states have opened up that window. Minnesota, I believe, is the most recent example, and then they went through, the diocese went through bankruptcy, was able to settle with the victims, was able to keep the church alive financially, was able to reorganize and do that. But in this case, our client is being prevented from bringing a civil lawsuit. So she would have to throw herself basically at the mercy of the current fund, which the bishop has refused, and for strategic reasons, has refused to disclose how much money is in that fund for all of the abuse victims, because he doesn't want anyone to have too much information for leverage purposes in trying to negotiate and determine how much money should be utilized for each victim from that fund.
But Barry, I do want to ask, because I think it's valid and fair, is there any amount of money that's going to make your client whole? Are they looking for a big payout? Is that going to help their healing? What is it your client is really, truly seeking?
No, there's never going to be an amount of money that can make my client or any abuse victim whole. One of the things we're trying to seek is to be compensated for all the money that has been spent in counseling away from work over the years. My client was devastated, as can be expected, because the abuse began at the age of 15 years old by a trusted priest who was trusted by her family. No amount of money can compensate her or the other victims for what they've gone through. But there is a need, because of the debilitating injuries, emotional injuries done to my client and to other victims. There is a need to give them an amount of money that allows them to be compensated for what they have paid out in the past, or money that they've lost through inability to work or pursue an education and do different things in life, and to allow them to live a comfortable life for the rest of their lives, knowing that the damage that is done at such a young age is really irreversible in a lot of cases. And my client is suffering the consequences and will suffer the consequences forever. But for the bishop to say that he is not going to just simply stop spending money for lobbyists, just agree to reopening the window like other states have done it, or just agree that you're going to have the church's lawyers just waive the statute of limitations. They can do that as part of a lawsuit. Let's move on from here. The church is not, the bishop is not, nobody is on that side is looking to just admit to everything that's been done, be transparent, compensate victims, set new procedures in place to make sure it doesn't happen again, and move on. Mike, that's what everyone wants.
Barry, thank you. Mike, let me ask you a question. You are on the other spectrum. You are representing a priest who has been accused of something. Has that priest, do you believe, been innocent until proven guilty, or are all these priests being put into one group that they're all guilty until proven innocent?
Well, you know, first, I want to agree with Barry Covert. Look, this doesn't have to be like this. This is really about Bishop Malone controlling the pot of money, controlling the process that prevents the priests from, in effect, going to court and getting a fair hearing. Barry Covert and I want due process for both the victims and for the priests. And what Bishop Malone does is he's dividing. And really this conference and this, now I'm going to go on TV and I'm going to talk to Mary Alice. These decisions weren't made in a vacuum. This is a strategic decision after speaking with his lawyers, after speaking with his PR people, after speaking with administrators. This is not really a full disclosure. We still don't have the number of priests on this list. So honestly, the process he has put in place absolutely convicts the priest without having any opportunity for due process. Basic principles of fairness do not apply under this present diocese. I have never in 30 years seen a procedure which prevents the accused from coming in front of the board who will decide their fate. It's like the Star Chamber. It's a ridiculous procedure.
And it is startling to hear, because there is a procedure that has been established. But we're going to hold up for one moment. We're going to head out to Dave McKinley, who has a priest who has just left the meeting. They are beginning to leave the Infant of Prague, and he's available to speak with us. So let's listen in.
Some were, there was a range of opinion. Some were unhappy, some were supportive, some were understood, some did not. One would expect that.
Did people, do you think, speak freely? Because again, you know, the bishop's your boss.
Oh, no. Absolutely. If there's anything at all, one could never think that the priests did not express their opinion.
So he was willing to listen?
Indeed, he was. Very receptive.
Did anyone say, Bishop Malone, Most Reverend, you should step down?
Yes, of course. There were several who said that. And yes, indeed. So as I say, the priests were not reticent about expressing their strong opinions for and against the bishop.
Father, your name?
Hinton.
Father Hinton? In which parish, sir?
I'm retired.
Oh, you're retired?
Yeah.
Well, good for you. Bless your heart. Your first name, Father Hinton?
Frederick.
Frederick. Thank you.
Then, again, that's our Dave McKinley outside Infant of Prague Church, where the diocesan priests were just meeting with Bishop Malone, and we had Father Frederick Hinton choosing to share his feelings with us. We'll be right back with more right after this. Welcome back to our special report. Right now, we are going to head back out to Infant of Prague Church, where our Dave McKinley is standing by. The priests have just left their meeting with Bishop Mansell, and Dave is efforting to find a priest who can share his thoughts. We were listening in, Dave, on you and Father Frederick Hinton.
Yeah, he did stop and speak to us. We have many more of the priests coming out now. Father, can you fill us in on the tenor of the meeting?
No, you have to go inside.
All right, we have to go inside. Well, that has been the response from most of the priests who continue to come on out of the Infant of Prague Church. However, Father Hinton told us much more. We'll share with you tonight at 5 and 6. Inside, though, Bishop Malone is about to speak.
Followed by some important information that we'd like to share with you. Bishop is joined today by several key members of the diocese staff, including Bishop Edward Gross, Father Peter Corrales, Father James Crolio, who will be coming over, Monsignor Sal, Sister Regina, Stephen Halter, Jacqueline Joy, Dom Blowy, and diocesan attorneys Terry Connor and Lawler Quinlan. Following the presentations, we will move to questions and answers. If you have a question, I'll ask you to meet me directly behind this row of chairs. Please form a line there, and I'll ask you to limit your question to one per news organization at a time. If time allows for more, we'll be happy to oblige. Without further delay, please welcome Bishop Malone.
Thank you, Kathy. And my apology, too, for our tardiness. As you can imagine, there were lots of priests with lots of questions and all, so we needed to honor that. So I'm sorry we're late for you. As the people who work closely with me know, I really like promptness, so it's not good. I'd like us, if you wouldn't mind, just to begin with a moment of calling upon God for healing for victims of abuse. This is a prayer that many of us pray every single day, and many of our parishes as well, and I pray it with a sincere love and heart. God of endless love, ever caring, ever strong, always present, always just, you gave your only Son to save us by his blood on the cross. Gentle Jesus, shepherd of peace, join to your own suffering the pain of all who have been hurt, in body, mind, and spirit, by those who betrayed the trust placed in them. Hear the cries of our brothers and sisters who have been gravely harmed, and the cries of those who love them. Soothe their restless hearts with hope, Steady their shaken spirits with faith. Grant them justice for their cause, enlightened by your truth. Holy Spirit, comforter of hearts, heal your people's wounds and transform brokenness into wholeness. Grant us the courage and wisdom, humility and grace to act with justice. Breathe wisdom into our prayers and labors. Grant that all harmed by abuse may find peace in justice. And we ask this, O Lord, in your holy name. Amen. Well, good afternoon again, and I thank you all for coming today. Before we get into the bulk of information that we want to share with you, and there's some significant information coming, I want to share a few personal thoughts. Just now, and the reason I'm late, at the meeting with priests and transitional deacons, I expressed my concern to them about how difficult it has been for them to carry out their priestly and pastoral ministry in the current atmosphere of crisis. Along with confusion and silence and misinformation, I know they have expressed deep compassion and attention to the people entrusted to their care. I assured them that together, we, priests, bishops, deacons, religious, and faithful lay people, the church we all love, together will be purified, renewed, and made stronger. I shared with them, and they agree, that too much is at stake: the faith and commitment of our people, the healing of victims, even our very mission in the world. Today, before we have some time for Q&A, I would ask your attentive listening to what will be presented by some members of my staff who are key in the whole challenge of responding to this crisis. Your understanding of the facts and the process is essential, and I'm thankful to you for the ways you really do try to be attentive to the facts. Today, I and others will be very specific and use precise words. It is not about semantics. We all know words can be misinterpreted or misunderstood, and that does not lead to fuller understanding and the ability to move forward. First and foremost, we are about healing. In March, when the Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Program was announced, we asked for victims to come forward. They have, and the numbers were overwhelming. I think the image, the word tsunami, is not inappropriate. And I say again now, this is not in my prepared notes, but I say again now, if still there are victims out there who have not come forward to us, I ask you please to do that so that we can respond. Addressing these cases, though, has taken more time than expected, and so we've instituted additional staff and procedures to work through all the cases to bring healing to our victims. Second, we must be about truth. Finding the truth can be difficult in these cases. This, too, unfortunately, takes time and cooperation. There are priests who have been placed on administrative leave and have been so for months. I want to resolve these cases as soon as possible. We have additional investigators now who are working on their cases. As much as we all want resolution, our investigations must be thorough, and while wanting to speed up the process, we cannot sacrifice the truth for speed. Being placed on administrative leave does not indicate guilt. We know some of our priests, especially in decades-old cases, are guilty and have caused great pain and suffering to their victims and victims' families. The truth, I believe, will bring some healing. Today, the diocese is publishing an additional list of priests who have against them substantiated allegations of sexual abuse of a minor. This list is divided in several categories. It's vitally important to understand those categories. Please know that we have done much to protect the victims and the accused. You know well the calls for my resignation. I have stated that I do not have plans to do that. I know that there may not be a high level of trust right now, but I do believe that working with others who continue to believe in me, we can steer through this storm into a calm sea. A resignation, of course, is not automatic. It requires the permission of the Holy Father. In addition, the Diocese of Buffalo deserves to regain stability. A resignation does not bring stability. In fact, it can exacerbate instability. With the work of the Independent Reconciliation Compensation Program, the new Office of Professional Responsibility, the new task force to create an effective protocol for handling claims of clerical abuse of adults, and our new director of the Office of Communications, together, I believe, and this is my commitment, my prayer, my hope, I believe we will build the stability needed to restore trust, strengthen faith, and hope among all of God's people. I thank Kathy Spangler, our new director of the Office of Communications, who will guide us through the rest of our meeting. A few more things for you, and then some opportunity for your questions and my response.
So I would like to start with Sister Regina Murphy. She has an announcement to make for you today. Sister?
Good afternoon. The bishop mentioned that we were going to release new names today, which we will. I'd like to preface that, however, by speaking just a bit about the process of dealing with priest files. As the chancellor of the diocese, I'm currently in charge of the files. Prior to that, which would be prior to this past April, I did a lot of work in the archives and assisted with Bishop Gross, sometimes doing some research, and I discovered back in 2016 that there seemed to be files in many different places, and I asked Bishop Malone if I could do an inventory, because that didn't seem like the best way to organize the files. He immediately said yes, and I did the inventory, and some priests had pieces of their file in as many as 4 or 5 different places. So I did a summary of what I found in the inventory, and that actually went public. It was one of those documents that was out there. And what wasn't known about that document, I believe it was dated May 1st, 2017. I had categorized priests according to where their files were. I had not yet read the files. You know, I might have glanced at them, but basically it was according to where they were. From that date, May 1st, 2017, until 2018, probably again this spring, I was reading all those files, putting them on a database, and finding out how many were misplaced. All the files were reorganized. They were all brought together into one place. So if you need a deceased priest file, it's in the main archives. If you need a living priest file, it's in the clergy file room. And every piece of information is in that file. The numbers that were out in the press earlier, when that May 1st, 2015 or 2017 document was released, are no longer accurate. Things are now much better organized, and the continuing updating of the database, which, given the number of recent cases, is very difficult to keep up with. But I think we're pretty well organized as of this moment. Today we're releasing an additional list of names. Diocesan priests, we will give you 20 names. And these are all priests with substantiated claims of abuse of a minor. We are also releasing 16 names of religious order priests, again with substantiated claims of abuse of a minor. So that's 36 names that will be released. And on your way out of this press conference, we will give you that. Just in summary, At the bottom of the list, it explains what our total numbers are on the current database. And, well, for example, total number on the database of priests with substantiated allegations would be, and this is both diocesan and religious order, would be 176. 66 of those are for the most part deceased with a single allegation. And keeping to our basic protocol, we are not releasing any deceased priest names with a single allegation. As of today, 78 of those names are publicized either in March or today. 20 priests are being investigated currently. And then there are another 12 who are kind of in the other category. Either the perpetrator could not be identified, they were cleared of wrongdoing, and in the case of religious order priests who could be missioned any place in the country, there were several cases where, I don't have the number right in front of me, there's about 6 or more cases where there was abuse, substantiated abuse, but it did not occur in this diocese, and so we did not release those names. You will also receive a graph that shows of the 70 some odd that we are releasing or have released, and it's based on both March and today. A graph showing when those particular perpetrators actually began the abuse, and this is what it will look like. You may have it. It shows you that most of the abuse is not occurring in the last 20 years, but most of the abuse has occurred between 1960 and 1970. In fact, there's no priest ordained in the last 20 years who has had an allegation of sexual abuse of a minor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Regina. Next, I would like to invite Lawler Quinlan, who will provide some historical context and explain some of our processes. Lawler.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin to talk about the historical context, I'd like to just share with you a comment that was made in one of our, in one of our meetings early on in this process. And that is that every Mass, Catholics do what's called a profession of faith. Sometimes we use the Apostles' Creed. Most times we use the Nicene Creed. It's a creed that came out of 2 councils in the 4th century. And at that time, the church leaders agreed upon a term to describe the Holy Spirit. And we say that the Holy Spirit is the Lord and the giver of life. What this is, this sex abuse of a child, is the exact opposite of that. It is the drainer of life. It is a life-draining, soul-sucking, strength-sapping, awful, terrible, and if I had more adjectives, I'd say them thing. It is that most of all, of course, for the victims. And I've spoken with dozens of them in the past few years, and I've seen how their lives have been destroyed by something that happened very early on. When a life like that gets changed in such a terrible way, it's sometimes never the same. And it's always amazing to me how that abuse manifests itself in a person. Sometimes you see 2 brothers who were raised by the same parents, have all other things in common, and were abused by the same priest. And one will go on with life, and you won't, from the outside, be able to tell that something was wrong. And the other will, his life's path will veer off and turn to substance abuse, violence, go through several wives. It's an awful, awful thing. And it's awful and life-draining for his family as well, especially the parents who feel bad about not having believed that child earlier on. It is also life-draining for the church as a whole, and each of the parishes, and the people who practice in them. People who are married by these priests or baptized by these priests, and they feel betrayed by the horrible crimes committed by a small percentage of the priests. And it's also life-draining for the good priests, the vast majority of priests out there who are giving their lives to God and to serve others, and they have to face this sort of awful suspicion of everyone looking at them thinking, is he one of the bad guys? It's a very difficult thing. And all of this is made worse here in Buffalo this year because the life-draining sex abuse crisis has been in the news, and that is certainly true. It's been all over the news. But people in this diocese, both because of the news in general and because of the recent 60 Minutes program, are under the impression that there is rampant child sex abuse going on right now in the diocese. And that is absolutely not true. And I have the numbers to demonstrate that. But before I get to the numbers, let me back up and give that historical perspective that Kathy was talking about. There is a date by which all of this must be examined, and that date is 2002 when the charter came out. It's either before then or after then because they're two very different stories. And I think people need to know that. Everybody remembers the crisis in Boston in 2002 and the stories that came out of it. The stories, first of all, of the horrible abuse itself. It is, as I said before, a life-draining, awful thing, and that was shocking enough. But the second thing that was shocking was the manner in which church leaders responded to it, when they learned about it. A lot of times it was hidden from the church, both by the priest who would intimidate the young person and convince him or her not to talk, or by when the kid finally did talk to a teacher or a parent or something and they'd not believe him or tell him, how dare you say that about a priest, or something terrible. But when it did get to the attention of the church, unfortunately, it wasn't always handled correctly. What had happened is sometimes people at that time, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, there was a belief, of course, the church believes in redemption and forgiveness, but there's also belief in the science, the psychiatry and psychology, that a person can go and talk to a counselor and that the person would change. The priest would be different and it could be placed someplace else. And that happened in Boston. And we all know what the terrible result was. Some of these priests continued to abuse, and we know the awful results. Did the church here in Buffalo make the same sort of bad decisions like that before 2002? Yes, it did. Sometimes it was handled correctly. Sometimes the right thing was done and the abuser was removed from ministry. But sometimes the abuse continued on, and what you see in the news happened. And we need to tell the stories of that abuse. We really do. Too many lives have been ruined. That chapter of the church's history needs to be exposed. Those stories need to be told, for sure. But if you hear nothing else I say today, hear this. When the story of this abuse crisis is told, whether it's by the media or by a government official someday or by historians years from now looking back, if the story ends in 2002 and only covers the abuse, then it isn't being fair to the church and it isn't telling the whole story. When the story is told, we must find what happened afterwards. We need to cover the sea change in the way these things were handled that happened in 2002 very clearly, and cover the positive story of what the church has been doing to bring the number of these occurrences, and this is true, way, way, way down. From the 50s, 60s, and 70s to the present, there is a dramatic change effective in 2002. In 2002, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops established a charter for the protection of young people, children and young people. You'll often hear about that referred to as the charter. That's what they're talking about. It's more than just a bunch of principles and policies. It required every diocese to establish what's called a diocesan review board. The notion was we don't want the decisions about what to do with these priests being made by a bishop and someone else in a room in the chancery. We want the lay people to be involved in these decisions, and they have been since 2002. Each diocese was required to assemble a review board that would be composed of people with good judgment and people with a variety of experiences. So you have, and here in Buffalo we've had retired judges, retired prosecutors, we've had medical professionals, people skilled in the treatment and understanding of child sexual abuse. And they sit down, and every single complaint that comes in needs to be presented to that group, a complaint of child sexual abuse. So Jackie Joy here is our victim assistance coordinator. And when a complaint comes in, what is supposed to happen is if you get it as a parish priest or a parent or a school person, you funnel it to Jackie. And Jackie does an intake form where she gets all the vital information about the priest, about the complainant, about when it happened, where it happened, what happened. And that information is then presented. There's a determination is made, a very low standard, whether it's manifestly false and frivolous or whether there's a dispute here. So, for example, sometimes the priest will be confronted with that and admit it in the first instance, and then the matter is taken care of. Other times it is determined you have a story that just can't possibly be true, like this priest wasn't even a priest yet for another 10 years. And so that low standard would be considered manifestly false. But the vast, vast majority of cases meet that low standard, and they get sent to the review board. Now, presently, they are investigated by someone. So we've always investigated them, but now we have Steve Halter, the former FBI agent, will be investigating them. We've previously had a former ADA assistant district attorney who handled sex crime, child sex crime cases, investigate them. And that person will gather information from both the priest and from the complainant and present it to the review board for their consideration. And I mentioned the people on that review board and the variety of backgrounds that they have and the experiences that they have, and the collective wisdom of that board is an impressive thing to see. And they take the cases very seriously, and they will ask the investigator sometimes to go out and speak to this person or that person, or get this piece of evidence to evaluate it. And then the review board makes a recommendation to the bishop, which is invariably accepted, as to whether the claim has been substantiated or not substantiated. If there's even a single claim of child abuse that is substantiated, that priest is removed from ministry, okay? We're going to come back later to the 60 minutes, but that priest is removed from ministry, and a process has started to have him removed from the clerical state, which is a different thing. The charter has requirements. The charter also has requirements for everybody working in the diocese. So it is not only responding to claims, it's also preventing abuse. And we have systems in place where everybody. I was a catechist at my kids' church, and to teach them religion, I had to go through the Virtus training. Virtus is just Latin for virtue, and it prepares people, tells them all about clerical sexual abuse and sexual abuse of all kinds, and it tells people to. Here's what you should be looking for. Here's what you should and shouldn't be doing with children. If you see something, say something. And it's a sort of encouraging of vigilance to protect kids going forward. And that's a huge component of what happened in 2002. All of what I'm talking about is post-2002, that big sea change of cases that I've been talking about. And the good news is, if there is any good news about this life-draining process, is that these practical changes have had a dramatic effect on the number of instances of childhood sexual abuse, both here in our diocese and all across the country. And the number of occurrences since 2000 are very, very, very few. And we'll get to exactly how many there are later. So why is the diocese all over the news this year? Why is this constantly in the paper? There are a few answers to that question. First, you need to know about the Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Program. Last year, in 2017, a few downstate dioceses came up with the notion that we ought to have a compensation program for victims, similar to the ones you see after disasters like the 9/11 or the oil spill in the Gulf Coast. And the notion is the person can come in either with an attorney or on his or her own, file a piece of paper, file a piece of paper, and and have their claim evaluated by an independent person or persons and make a decision about the claim and award them compensation. And in this case, these dioceses downstate were doing it. And we looked at that and we saw that it was pretty successful. You know, the first we were skeptical that people wouldn't want to do it, that they say, oh, you know, we want to go in court and sue people, and if this statute that passes, that's what we want to do. But instead, what we've heard from both victims and from their attorneys, is that they like this process, the one that was down going on downstate, because it's quicker, it's easier, it's less confrontational. And so the bishop instituted one here. And when he did that, and we had a big press conference, he made the announcement, as he had made many times before, if you know somebody who's been abused, or if you yourself have been abused, come forward. Tell us about it. Please, if you know about claims, come forward and respond. And that's exactly what happened here. We had an idea. We anticipated that we'd probably receive an increase in the number of claims that would come in. But the bishop had no idea that the response would be so overwhelming. To put it in perspective, let me give you an idea of our past experience. Every year, the diocese has to do an annual audit. And it's one that you keep a record of the claims that have come in that year. It starts on July 1st and ends June 30th. And you're supposed to report all of the new claims that came in that year. By new claim, I mean new to the Diocese of Buffalo, new information that we are hearing for the first time. It doesn't mean that it just happened, okay? So many of these new claims are about things that happened a long time ago, but the person's coming forward for the first time. And those need to be included in an audit. So last year, or the year before, the 2016, 2017, we reported 7 new claims, okay? That was typical. The year before that, it was, I think, 4. This year, the Diocese of Buffalo, from the July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018, received 191 new claims. That includes the claims that we received through the Jackie, and also the claims that came in through the IRCP. Now, of course, many of the IRCP claims we already knew about, so they wouldn't be considered in that number. But this is, we try to make an accurate record of the new claims that came in this year, or new reports of child sexual abuse, and it was 191. And they, and frankly, it was, it overwhelmed our systems. You've heard talk about the phones not being sufficient. You've heard talk about claims that should be handled by someone like Jackie, who is a licensed clinical social worker. She is the person who should be interacting with a victim, not someone else at the chancery. And yet there were so many calls coming in that they often were, and the people were waiting to hear back. And Jackie has another job that she does, and is used to having a very few number of claims come in a year. Instead of getting 11 claims in a year, you're getting 190 claims in a few months. It overwhelms our process. And we had receptionists, secretaries, responding, making the initial contact, not doing what Jackie does, but making the initial contact. And you know, that shouldn't have been the way it happened. And what we did is responded as quickly as we could. We brought back, the bishop brought back Jackie's predecessor, who was also a licensed clinical social worker, out of retirement, and she helped respond to these claims. But let me go back to that number of 191, because this is very important. Remember, this is our most recent year audit, okay? We'll do another one next year and another one next year. But this is our most recent data set. It has the 190 claims that are coming, 191 claims that are coming in for the first time this year. And it's the freshest batch of data that we have. And of those claims, how many of the people were claiming that their abuse had occurred since 2000? 0. Not a single claim of a kid who said, I was abused in 2002 or 2003 or 2017. None. And there weren't that many in the 90s or the 80s. The vast majority of these claims, and we have the charts and you have them, it's consistent with the national data. Now, we have had claims since 2000. I don't want anyone to misunderstand that. And previously, and some of them public, we had a priest who possessed child pornography in 2004. He's on the list. We had 2 other priests. Okay, so there are a few instances, but it's extremely rare and way less common now because of what the church did in 2002. There was a dramatic reduction, and I think this data shows that the 2002 charter is working, the review board is working, the vigilance is also working. And you know what else is working? It's the awareness of the people. One of the saddest things you hear when you speak with some of these victims is that when they finally decided to say something to a mom or a grandma or a teacher or a nun, that the person yelled at them. How dare you say that about a priest? Or slapped the kid, or washed his mouth out with soap. It's almost like a second victimization. I asked the people who are watching this on our live feed, of the 600-some thousand people in the Diocese of Buffalo, all you mothers and grandmothers out there, if your kid came home today, your loved one, and said to you that, Mommy, Grandma, today when I was with a priest, he took his pants off in front of me. Is there a single person in the entire state that wouldn't believe that kid or wouldn't respond by calling the police, calling the diocese and taking action? This vigilance has resulted in a dramatic reduction. Of the 191 claims, not one since 2000. So the notion, to the extent you see it in the news all the time, that there's ongoing abuse or that the priests that are with your kids are abusing them is not true. And I hope that's that people take that message away from this conference. The second thing is, the reason why people are worried is this 60 minutes conference, or 60 minutes interview. There was this suggestion, and you saw the interview back and forth with Father Ziliaks and the questioner, and how many, he was talking about priests being removed from the priesthood, okay, from the priesthood. And what Father Bob, I don't dispute, he was technically correct. What he said is there were 8 or 9 priests that he would argue, I would argue actually a little bit higher than that, but he would argue should be removed from the priesthood, that is, permanently removed from the clerical state. And so when he asked that, well, I think there should be 8 or 9. Then the questioner said, or Whitaker said, and how many of them are still in the priesthood today? And he said, all of them, and dropped this big pumpkin in the middle of the interview. And everybody in America was like, oh my gosh, what's going on in Buffalo? What are these people thinking? They got 8 or 9 pedophiles interacting with kids in church and at schools? That is totally not true. Technically, what he was saying is they haven't been removed from the clerical state, but they have been removed from ministry. He has since confirmed that. They are not in ministry. They're not at your school. They're not at the church. If they go to the grocery store, they can't wear the Roman collar. They are perhaps sitting at home in khakis and a red sweater. Okay, and so what Father Bob Ziliaks, when he made that statement, okay, what does it mean to be removed from the clerical state? Well, and Father Sal can talk about this later, you have to go through these canonical processes where you make this big, thick packet called a votum, and you send it over to Rome. They usually send it back, and then you have to do a canon law trial. And we did that for Father Franzak, for example. But you know what? Father Franzak still has not been removed from the clerical state. Despite all that work, we still got to finish the trial, and then it will be the case. So the notion that the person needs to be removed from the clerical state will have zero impact on the people's lives around that person. The priest, the day before he's removed from the clerical state and the day after he was removed from the clerical state, his life, so far as everyone else can observe, is identically the same. He is not a priest. He is a priest, but he's not what you and I would call a priest. He's not saying Mass. He's not seeing kids. He's not wearing the Roman collar. No one's getting confused by him wearing clerical garb. Those 8 or 9 people are all not acting as priests. Okay, the list of abusers, I'll turn to that. And this is the second part of what I want to talk about, and that's what Sister presented. let me first say that the list, creating a list of priests who have substantiated claims of abuse against them, is not something the bishop was required to do. No bishop in the history of Buffalo had ever done that. Many dioceses across the country, we were one of the early ones. They're now starting to follow. It's becoming the trend to create these lists and to advise people. And the bishop decided to create a list of abusers. The idea behind it is that it does two things. It allows for some transparency for people to see what has happened. And it also, when a victim sees the name of his or her abuser on the list, it's the sense that you're giving that person a sense of validation. Okay, and so that was the goal of what was to be done. So Sister Regina and I and a group of others set out to achieve what the bishop wanted. And we knew that the more names provided, the more the victim survivors would be satisfied. But we also did not want to make the mistake of including a priest's name incorrectly. Once a priest's name is included on the list of what people would say a list of child abusers, you cannot unring that bell. So it needs to be done very carefully. The other thing we wanted to avoid in making the list is to, we wanted to avoid saying that this victim was believable or credible and that others were not. Our thought is if you make a list of credibly accused priests that doesn't include a particular priest on it, and you're the victim and you look up for your abuser, then you're basically saying, okay, they don't believe me. They're discounting my claim, and we did not want to do that. So we did create, and it's been criticized, the carefully crafted criteria. The objective was that we wanted to have criteria that couldn't be questioned by anyone. They were objective and very objective criteria. So for example, we started off with the priests would be easy. The priests who were removed from ministry or had been forced into retirement or retired after allegations of abuse had been made against them. That was easy. Then what do you do? We had two other issues we had to address. The first is, what do you do with religious order priests? Most Catholics know that not every priest is a diocesan priest. You have your Franciscans, Jesuits, Vincentians, Passionists. Believe it or not, I was surprised to learn that there's like over 100 orders. Bishop Grosh, you would tell me? Yeah, that have served in the diocese at various times. And so we knew of some abuse by those order priests. So can you put them on the list? Well, the bishop doesn't have, he has authority to allow these people to minister in the diocese, but he doesn't have the authority to take the discipline on them if something needs to be addressed in that way. And he doesn't have control over them. They could be in this diocese for 5 years and then go to China for 5 years and then go to, and I'm not being facetious, they will go around the world to different areas. So we may not know where this priest is. So what do you do with the order priests? Well, when we receive a complaint, when the diocese receives a complaint of, against an order priest and it gets reported, Bishop Grosh will contact the provincial, that's the boss of that of this province of a particular order, and say, hey, Father so-and-so, we have a complaint against him. We may fax the thing over or email it or whatever. And we get the information to the order for a good reason, because that order knows where that priest is. That order can call up that priest and say, get down here, like Bishop Grosh can do for a diocesan priest, and confront him and talk to him about it. That order can also respond to the victim better. They have people like Jackie Joy, and they have victim assistance coordinators of their own in many cases. And so we turn it over to the order priest. So we decided back then, or the bishop decided after we talked that issue with him, he said, we're not going to include order priests because the orders, that's theirs. I don't have an ability to discipline them. We can't investigate it. The priest may be out of the diocese, nowhere near here. And so you can't responsibly put the name of that priest on a list having done no investigation whatsoever. And so the determination was the order priests weren't going to go on the list. Now, were we trying, was the bishop trying to hide the fact that there was abuse by order priests? Absolutely not. That was already in the news. Immediately when the list came out, people said, hey, wait a second, you don't have the order priest there. Yes, and if you read who's on the list, it clearly says that we're not, that the order, you can see that the order priest would not be on it. But everyone was upset with that, and so we're trying to change that a little bit in our new list. But let me go back to the first one. So, what do you do with deceased priests, okay? Many dioceses don't even publish a list of deceased priests. And the reason is because when a priest is dead, maybe dead 60 years, but oftentimes 10, 5, 20 years before the first allegation comes out, that priest doesn't have a chance to defend himself. You can't say, I wasn't there, or I was here, or this didn't happen, or go ask Sister Jones, or whatever. You can't defend yourself against the claim if you're deceased. There is no prosecutor in the world who would prosecute a deceased person. Not the Assistant District Attorney, not the U.S. Attorney, not the Crown of England. Nobody would prosecute a dead person because they can't respond to the charges. But on the other hand, we have situations where we know, or where the sister and I could see from the files, that a particular deceased priest had a number of complaints against him. And so it seems like that the number of complaints, shouldn't you, if you have a person who has 5 claims against him, doesn't that kind of tell you that it's highly unlikely that he wasn't abusing these kids? So we had, this issue was there. I don't make the decision, sisters make the decision. We talked to the bishop, and the bishop made the call. 2 or more allegations, you're going on the list. We're not going to put it out, if there's only 1 allegation on the priest, we'll note it, we'll record it, we'll keep it in the file, and if a subsequent allegation comes in, that priest will be moved onto the list. But for a deceased priest, or if they have more than 1 allegation, they're on the list. If they don't, they're not. And that's still the rule that's being followed when Sister and I prepared this list. By the way, sorry. Oh, by the way, there's also, when the bishop made that decision, it was mainly just a practical decision on how to resolve these competing concerns about not putting a priest on who didn't have a chance to defend himself and putting a person on with multiple allegations. But people should know that the priests that were on that list, when we published that earlier this year, the diocese received calls from the families of those deceased priests, okay? And they were very upset. And the bishop asked me to speak with those families, and I spoke with 3 of them. And they were tough calls. You had the family saying, hey, wait a second, where did you get off putting my uncle, I'm named after my uncle. I have the same first name and middle name. I'm named after him. And Bishop Head didn't put him on any list. Metzel, what is going on in Buffalo? How do you do that? How can you do that to my deceased relative? He never had a chance to defend himself. And I would have conversations with these families and say, I'll tell you all that you can bear to hear. And I'd go through it. But the notion that who cares is a dead guy, you need to realize these are real live human beings who had left footprints on this earth and have families that remember them. So we don't have any qualms about putting a person on with 2 or more allegations, but to put one on with just 1 allegation, we haven't done that. Okay. When the lists were released, there's a lot of criticism of the diocese. I mentioned the criticism of the family of the deceased priest, but there was also the criticism that we didn't incorporate the order priests. As I said before, I think it should have been obvious that we weren't including, from the description on the top, priests with 1 allegation or order priests. But the bishop heard those criticisms, okay? And so these when we're preparing the new list, he gave new instructions and said, order priests, if they have 2 or more allegations on them, put it there, even though we didn't have a chance to investigate it, because, again, in the same thinking, that it's highly unlikely there would be 2 and have it not be legitimate. And Sister did research looking on the internet and stuff. If we had 1 allegation here in Buffalo, but looking at news stories from around the country, we saw that this same particular order priest was accused elsewhere, then we took that as some sort of verification that this person belonged on the list. So that resulted in the 16 names going on the list. Okay. So now people are going to ask, how did you go from because Sister mentioned the number 176. How did you go from 42 to 176? Last time you gave us a list of 42, now you're talking about 146. The answer is we didn't. We went from 42 to 62. If you apply the categories and the determination factors that we applied to the first list, you have 42 diocesan priests. Now we have 62. Why is it jumping up? Is it because we hid the other 20 before? No, it's because we got 190 claims in last year against a lot of priests. And so it resulted in priests, diocesan priests ending up on the list. Okay. We're also adding the 16 order priests. So both the diocesan and the order priests put together is 78. So 78 priests are going on the list. 176 are priests who have allegations on them. People are going to ask, what's the deal? Where are the 98 unnamed priests, right? That's going to be the question. And by the way, last time we never gave before, just like the bishop never gave a list of credibly accused priests or substantiated claims against priests. The bishop until now has never given the instruction to give the number of priests against whom there have been allegations. So you're getting names on 78, but you're getting the number unnamed on the 176. So who are the unnamed, almost 100 priests that are on there? The vast majority are deceased priests with one allegation, like I talked about. The order priests with one allegation. And then you see on Sister's list, there are a few priests who are in active ministry, who have an allegation against them, okay? Not a substantiated allegation. These allegations were reviewed and determined not to be substantiated. To give you an example, I'm not going to name the priest because we're not giving you the name because we didn't determine it to be substantiated. But I want to let you know of the sort of thing that is being presented and what's being determined so that you can understand it's being done responsibly. We had a case of a woman who mailed an anonymous complaint to our victim assistance coordinator. She declined to identify herself or to provide any contact information. She wrote that she had a dinner conversation with her sister a couple of years ago, and her sister had recounted being attacked by a man in her high school 30 years earlier. The victim wouldn't identify her attacker, but the sister, the one who filed the form, drew the conclusion in her own mind that it was probably the priest against whom she was filing this complaint. The review board considered this. We had no one to talk to. We had an anonymous complaint from a woman about her sister, and it was deemed unsubstantiated, and that priest is in service. We have another case of a father who reported that his son had been abused 24 years earlier, and this sometimes happens. We have people say, my son or my friend or my sister or whoever was abused, and we try and reach out to the person who was abused, and that person doesn't corroborate or doesn't cooperate or doesn't talk to us. You know, again, there's a claim out there. The father says, you know, I think that this happened a number of years ago. The son, who's now an adult, will not cooperate or speak with us. The decision has to be made. That's not a substantiated claim. Another example, a priest received an anonymous letter that included that the claim that this priest had engaged in sexual improprieties years ago in the past. The priest, the good man, took that letter with no obligation to do so, and he notified the bishop right away. Said, I want you to know I got this anonymous complaint against me. I don't understand it. I don't know what this person's talking about. I've never done anything like this, and I don't know who it is or what it's all about. That priest is still an active priest. And I don't think anyone is going to say we're hiding an abuser or a pedophile. The bishop makes the determination with the recommendation of the review board what to do. And those decisions are, and the review board takes their responsibilities incredibly seriously. But when we look at something, I shouldn't say we, it's the review board, they look at something and they make a determination. They have to decide, is it substantiated or not substantiated? And those are just some examples. Let me give you some other examples of the numbers in the gap just to give you an idea, because some of them are alive. So we have the deceased priest with one allegation, the order priest. There are also this kind of a thing. We have a priest that was ordained in the early 70s, was in ministry for only 4 years before he was laicized. That means you can ask him, the priest, say, I no longer want to be a priest, I want to get married or whatever, and he was laicized. He became an Episcopal priest. and he moved to another city across the country. When we received the notice of this claim, Bishop Grosz contacted the relevant Episcopal diocese to report the claim. They had their attorney call me and was asking, what's this all about? I said, we have the claim right there. Since this is not, this is a priest who was here with us for 4 years in the 1970s, we're just turning it over to you because he's now a priest in your diocese. And she said, has this been reported to the district attorney? I explained that we have a memorandum of understanding as to we report any claim that's prosecutable. And I said, but I tell you what, I'm going to give you the number for the assistant district attorney who handles these cases, and you can call her yourself. And she did. The district attorney didn't do anything, but now it's in the hands of that diocese, the Episcopal diocese, to deal with that thing. I don't know how many of these I should do. I'll do another one. Here's a man, because we have so many press people, this is a good one, I think. This is a man who was ordained a priest in Colorado. He went on leave in 1963 and never returned. He came to the Auburn area in the 1970s and founded a home for mentally ill veterans. Over the next 30 years, he would occasionally celebrate Mass at a church in Auburn, even though he was not a priest of the Rochester Diocese. He apparently committed abuse there in 1973, and years later, the abused boys filed a claim in the Albany Diocese. They had done a similar thing to our IRCP years ago. The man stopped functioning as a priest at that point because it's big news. This guy's not even a priest, and he's abusing kids. He's acting like a priest, pretending he's a priest, but he's not. So he stopped, and he moved to Buffalo. Mike Desmond, who was then at WNED, now at WBFO, called the Diocese of Buffalo and said, hey, I don't know if you know about this guy, but he's in the Buffalo area. He never served as a priest here. I don't even know if he's still alive. If he is, he'd be 89 years old. But his name is not going on the list because we didn't investigate. It was abuse that didn't occur here, and it's not something we put on our list. So that gives you an idea of this gap of who are the people in between. Most of them are deceased priests or order priests who have only one allegation, and the others are kind of in a potpourri like I just gave you. So I'm probably taking too much time, but let me, am I? What's that?
Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
No, I got a little bit. Can I keep going?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, people are saying, you know, when is this crisis going to be over? Why? How long are we going to keep hearing about this? And I get it, but these stories are important and they need to be heard, and they need, when the claims come forward, they need to be addressed. It's a life-draining mess, but it's a mess that the church has to deal with. We have to respond to these victims. We have to provide the assistance where we can, and we need to do justice if that priest is still around. And toward the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln talked about the Civil War as being sort of a divine retribution for the evils that the slave owners in the South had done and the whipping that they had done of their slaves. What's that? Yeah, sure, excuse me. So when Lincoln was asked in the second inaugural, he said that the Civil War will last until every last drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword. And I think if someone had asked him after the war, well, do you think it's over? Do you think you've now made up for slavery because you compensated with the war for what had happened? The South was punished. Does that make up for it? And the answer is, of course not. The effects of slavery lingered for decades, and some would argue with good reason that they exist today. And the abuse crisis is going to be no different. It's going to be with us for a long time. But I think what I've been trying to show is there's been a dramatic reduction since 2002, and the church has made a huge change in the way it treats these cases. Now, have there been mistakes in the church since 2002? Of course there have. Exhibit A are the 2 letters to the Apostleship in the See for Father Art Smith that everyone wishes the bishop had never sent. It was a mistake. He has apologized for it. There's going to be probably some other mistakes as we go forward. But if you look at the history of the church and the dramatic changes in programs, changes in the way we treat these cases, you're going to see, and we'll continue to see, a dramatic drop in this abuse. So there is some good news in all of it. Thank you.
Next, I would like to invite Monsignor Sal to come up and share some information with you about cases going to Rome.
You heard from Lawler talking about the year 2002 and the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People. What happened in 2002 was the United States bishops gathered in Dallas, where they put together this Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People to be followed by all the dioceses in the United States whenever there was a substantiated allegation of child sexual abuse presented to a diocese. And this has been followed since that time. And what happens with this is once an allegation is substantiated and presented to the diocese, then it must be presented to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. With all of our cases that we are dealing with now, many of them are old cases, and so the bishop wrote to Rome asking the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith if they would still accept our old cases that we have in our files to be presented to them. They said yes. The reason it's presented to them is they then tell us how to proceed, and there's one of three ways that they would ask us to proceed, which they have in the past. We sent a request over to Rome how to proceed on a priest who was accused of child sexual abuse, and they referred it back to us to conduct a penal trial. That is now underway, being conducted by 3 different judges. They are not in the Diocese of Buffalo. They're all canon lawyers in different dioceses around the country. And that is being done because they can be more objective than having somebody within the diocese to make a judgment about one of their priests. In order to protect objectivity, it's sent to other judges outside the diocese. One of the other things that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith can tell us to do is to put the priest on a life of prayer and penance. That means he's removed from active ministry, cannot represent himself as a priest, cannot dress as a priest, cannot function publicly as a priest. Or a third option they have is dismissal from the clerical state, meaning the priest is completely removed from the priesthood. One of the things that came out of this Dallas Charter was if there is one offense that's substantiated, the person must be removed from ministry. That has been happening since 2002. In the Diocese of Buffalo, that had already been happening. Anyone accused of child sexual abuse was immediately removed from active ministry and put on a life of prayer and penance. So these are the things that every diocese in the United States must follow, and that is what we have been following since it was published in 2002 by the U.S. bishops that were gathered together in Dallas at the time to solve some of the issues that were confronting the church at that time.
Thank you, Monsignor Sal. I'd now like to invite Terry Connors to shed some light on investigations.
I've been asked to provide you with an update with respect to some matters that have been reported publicly so that you'd have firsthand knowledge with respect to what investigations there are currently pending in our diocese and throughout the state of New York. So first of all, if we start in a chronological fashion, you should know that in late May of 2018, I received a call from a local prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's the federal prosecuting agency. Essentially, the prosecutor told me that the U.S. Attorney would like to look at some paperwork, some documents, some files with respect to any allegations against priests that were after 1990. It's a significant difference because in the federal statutes, there's a position they take legally that 1990 is the cutoff with respect to the statute of limitations. So we asked to have a subpoena provided, which is standard practice. We got those materials and we provided them to the prosecutor. That information has been exchanged and an open extension has been granted so that they can come back and ask us if they desire any additional information with respect to that investigation. But that investigation is a potential criminal investigation. They're looking at conduct on the part of priests, is what I was told, to determine whether there's a federal jurisdictional nexus. Was there travel across state lines? Was there use of child pornography? Was there use of any digital operations such as Facebook or internet transmissions? Things of that nature to determine whether or not there is a basis to proceed with a federal prosecution. We have not heard anything since we've had our initial contact and complied with the subpoena, and so we're waiting to have an update with respect to that. The next matter took place in September of 2018. That is, as you know, a statewide investigation, civil investigation, not criminal investigation, conducted by the Office of the Attorney General. The Attorney General, through their Charities Bureau, is asking for a number of documents that pertain to the use of funds that parishes, the dioceses might use throughout the state of New York. Each and every diocese has been asked to respond. We've worked out a protocol because it involves a lot of electronically stored information so that we can provide it in different segments, and right now that is a matter that's under negotiation with the Office of Attorney General. We meet and discuss regularly with them and with the other attorneys for the diocese in the state of New York so that production can be done in a logical and orderly fashion. That has to do with allegations that would be in violation of the Religious Corporations Law, the Estate Powers and Trust Law, the civil laws that provide status to a corporation that's a religious, or the term is often known as an eleemosynary institution. They're looking to see if they violated the charter, and we've agreed to cooperate. Bishop Malone has instructed me to cooperate with that investigation, and I am cooperating with that investigation. Sure.
Okay.
In addition, there's another litigation matter, which is primarily what I handle. A civil case was filed by Matthew Golden against only the Diocese of Buffalo, and that was filed in New York State Supreme Court. It was filed with a theory, somewhat innovative theory, by an attorney named Jeff Anderson, who does a lot of this work. Essentially, the claim was that the exoneration of Father Reiter and returning him to active ministry was in some way a public nuisance. And that theory has been put into a summons and complaint and provided to the diocese. We've looked at it carefully, and we found that just last week, the same theory by the same lawyer was tried against the Rockville Center Diocese. And the appellate division of the second department, which is the guiding department that covers those cases, it's the next highest department except for the Court of Appeals. They ruled that that should be dismissed, that there's no foundation or basis for such a claim. We filed a similar motion modeled after that particular decision that was rendered by the second department. You may have read about a case that was filed, a comprehensive case that was filed in Manhattan, the Supreme Court of Manhattan. It's a case by one plaintiff against all of the dioceses in the state of New York. It has some of the similar claims to the litigation that I just spoke about, but it's expanded the reach a little bit. It's premised upon a claim of an abuse of one individual who I believe is a resident of Queens, but the abuse may have occurred in the Brooklyn Diocese. But in addition to filing the claim on behalf of that individual, they named every diocese in the state of New York. Now, that litigation is on a slower track. In fact, all of the dioceses have not yet even been served. So it is going to move a lot more slowly, and it will move in another court in another venue. But I thought I should let you know about that in case you weren't aware of that. The final piece of litigation that I'm working on deals with a request that comes out of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. It's obtained some notoriety. It's a request by the prosecutors in that district, which encompasses Philadelphia as well, so they've had quite a bit of experience in connection with those prosecutions from the grand jury investigation there, the state grand jury investigation. This is federal. They essentially sent a letter to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The letter said, there's no need to do anything right now. There's no need to produce documents or even respond to this letter. But we ask you, as the leader of all the bishops and the other dioceses, to seek to communicate with each diocese nationwide to ask them to hold on to their documents. Now, for us, that was no big deal because we were already doing that as well, and nothing has come of it yet. But that request has been sent out by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's certainly been honored by our diocese, and I expect that we will continue to cooperate with these investigations and the other aspects of the litigation as it moves forward. That's the up-to-date. That's the status of the cases and the investigations that I'm working on and that I'm handling. That's your first-hand report with respect to these matters. Kathy?
I am back here now, so if you have questions, I am back here, so if you're a reporter and you have a question, we'd like you to ask one question at a time. Certainly, if we have more time, we're happy to have you come back. So, Charlie, go first.
Bishop, I want to go down. Bishop, I want to go down a list of specific cases here, and just to get you to explain why you handled them the way you did. You have said here that you have never protected any priest accused of abusing a minor. Why did you leave Father Fabian Mariansky in ministry for more than 5 years, despite an allegation of statutory rape when the victim was 16 years old?
Father Mariansky's case was handled by one of my predecessors years before I came.
We're talking about you now.
I know that. Let me answer the question, please. Okay? And so Mariansky was sent off for evaluation and treatment, which at that time said he could be returned to ministry. We would never do that now. We would never do that now since 2002. And so that's what happened. Then when I arrived, we discovered, actually fairly recently, a few months ago, we received a letter from the alleged victim who raised that question for the first time that I saw, and that's when I reopened the investigation. So I just wasn't aware of all this that had happened before I arrived.
But her case was in the black binder that Mr. Connors prepared for you. So did you not read that binder when you became bishop?
I read through it. A lot of the priests in there were already removed from ministry, as you know. But in this particular case, I learned later, in this particular case, there was even a difference of opinion, if I'm not incorrect, Terry, about the age of the individual. Do you want to comment on that quickly? This is a legal point, I think, that's important for you.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question here.
After you get this remark, you will.
Okay.
So I think it's important to have some additional factual background about this particular case. It's 25 years ago. It came in 1995. And obviously, from all the presentation you've heard today, things will be handled much differently. But at the time that it came in, we went back, I researched it because of anticipating a question like this. And we did prepare a binder and prepare a summary for the bishop. But what we learned back in 1995 is that the correspondence from her attorney said that essentially Father Mariansky befriended his client in 1990 is what one of the letters said. So we went and looked at it, and she was born in 1968. So that would make her 21 or 22. So there was contradictory information. Several people reached out from the chancery to the attorney to get some additional information. It remained contradictory. And what happened, I think, back in 1995, as best I can put together, is that it was treated as a case of adult abuse. And at that time, it was done, what was done throughout the country, is that Father Fabian Mariansky was sent to be evaluated by no less than 3 to 5 institutions where he would be out of service for 5 years until finally he came back, and after being evaluated, this was by Bishop Manzel, was placed back into service because the evaluators told him that it was 100% safe to put him back into service. Those are the facts I was able to put together. Hopefully they're helpful.
Which we would never do now.
But you let him minister for 5 years. Why?
He was out for 5 years.
He was in a church for the whole time that you have been here as bishop. He has been in a church until the day the story was in the news. Why?
Because that's when we discovered, just recently this spring, when I discovered that we had this new letter from the young woman who was making the complaint. I had heard already Terry's explanation of what had happened with a difference of opinion about the age at that time.
Okay, Father Dennis Ryder is alleged to have molested not one, not two, but 3 minors. You suspended him, put him back into ministry earlier this year, before all of the victims were even interviewed. Why? I don't want to hear from Terry.
Well, you're going to have to hear from my attorneys. I've been dealing with so many of these cases, Charlie, that the details in my weary brain, seriously, get mixed up. Can you comment at Lower?
No, I don't want to. Who runs this diocese? Is it you or is it Terry Wilder?
It is I, but I rely heavily upon those who advise me on the details of these cases.
I'm gonna let the other journalists answer a question, but
Sure, I don't want to leave that one unanswered, Mr. Speck. The bishop doesn't he makes the final determination on any priest case, but he makes it after it's been reviewed by the review board. This case was investigated, and you say, why didn't you talk to all the victims? Our investigator went out and spoke with the victims that he could speak with, and he wrote letters to the attorney for the other victim, and that attorney ignored letter after letter after letter. And like the press often does, as soon as you make the decision, he's like, gotcha, why didn't you talk to me first? We tried to talk to that person again and again. And when he finally did that, Mr. Specht, we did go out and interview that person. That thing was fully vetted. All the information was obtained. There were a number, I don't want to, you know what, I don't want to get into the claims, except to say that they were presented to the review board. And I'm going to protect the confidentiality, but it was all considered, and the review board recommended the bishop unanimously that Father Ryder be returned to ministry, and it was fairly done. That's the charter working. Now, sometimes as you know, 2 priests were within a month of that removed from ministry. So the review board looks at the facts.
Your investigator was so incompetent, he was asking me for phone numbers. So.
Oh, that's great.
He's being very thorough.
He had a number of years prosecuting these cases for the Erie County District Attorney's Office. Sex crimes. Okay.
I'm gonna let the other journalists answer something, but I just want to ask you. You've talked to every news organization in this room except ours. Many of our viewers feel like you're hiding from the tough questions. Are you afraid to do an interview with us?
I'm not afraid to, but I watch the approach that Channel 7 takes, and it would make anyone wary, I think. But I'm certainly not entirely close to it.
Several of you have referenced the 2002 Dallas Charter. However, that charter focuses on minors. It doesn't address seminarians or adults ages 18 and older.
Right.
Are we looking at this through the wrong lens? I mean, does that charter go far enough, and do we need to set a different bar?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is the charter does not go far enough. It was established in response to the terrible crisis in Boston, to deal with, in an effective way, with allegations of clerical abuse of minors. And I do believe the evidence shows it's very effective. What we need now is some kind of similar protocol that would take more seriously the ways we ought to handle allegations of misconduct by a priest with an adult. This is where I know I've made some missteps. Traditionally, when a priest has been accused of misconduct with an adult, we have tried to work with that priest quietly. You'd call it a cover-up, we call it confidentially, so as not to have a big explosion in the parish. Father Yetter, for example, was a very effective and highly esteemed pastor by many people in Swarmville. So sometimes you try to work with the priest, help him see the errors of his ways, send him for evaluation, but it's the wrong way. Would I do it that way again? No. But that's because we need a protocol, and I have established a committee of entirely lay women and lay men who are going to be working on creating a protocol for us. It's also possible that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops may work on something like that too. I'm going to bring that up personally. But it's a very, very important question.
And then really quickly, Bishop, I'd like to know if there's a timeline for victims with the Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Program. Have any settlements been made? Are victims aware of impending settlements? Because several of them have said they've heard very little from the diocese. Yeah,
well, they won't hear from us. They'll hear from the program is run by, as you know, by 2 former judges, and they're the administrators of the program, and it's entirely independent of us. So I can't even give them a call and say, could you hurry this up? But it is, I understand how frustrating it is for the victims, but I know they're working hard on it, studying all the claims and inviting. The people have the right to go in too, not just to send in their claim, but to go in and meet with both of these judges.
Is there a reason the Buffalo Diocese chose those two former judges as opposed to the administrators used for that fund that every other diocese in New York State uses?
Well, we thought it would be good to use two judges who know Western New York, who are known here and esteemed by the people, and also the ones that were being used by the other dioceses, I think, were pretty loaded with work to do. So that's why we had confidence in the two, and we still do, in the two judges we're using.
Hello, Bishop Malone. Mark Ashkarian from Spectrum News.
I'm sorry.
For the record, I would just like to add that our station was also not given access to a one-on-one sit-down with you as of yet. My question is, would you have been releasing this information if it hadn't been reported locally and nationally or on TV? Would this information be coming out?
Which information specifically?
The information about the list of the priests and all the allegations of abuse.
Oh, absolutely. Once I made the decision back in, when do we issue the thing? February, to put out, in March rather, March 1st, to put out those names. We had been pondering that for a while because there were lots of pros and cons. There were people in the diocese who didn't think it was a good thing, that it would possibly even re-victimize some of the victims to hear about it again. But I think it's more important that victims can see the name publicly put forth of the person who abused them, so that if they haven't come forth, that can empower them then to take that step.
My follow-up question to this is, does this crisis perhaps spark a new way of thinking in the Catholic Church? Should priests be allowed to marry? Should women be, priests as well? It may not solve the problem, but wouldn't it curb it just a bit?
I don't know whether you could claim that it would curb it at all. I mean, the question of whether priests can marry is kind of an open question in the Church. I mean, it's a long-established tradition that priests are celibate in the Latin Church, the Western Church. If the Pope decided to change that, he could. The ordination of women is a matter of doctrine that I don't think can be changed. But I'm not sure either of those would affect the sexual abuse challenge, because the numbers show that an awful lot of abusers are married men, sadly.
Bishop Mike Baggerman with WBEN Radio. On Friday, you were on our radio station. You said you were not aware of any allegations against current priests. About 24 hours later, two clergymen were placed on leave, Father Ron Sajak and Monsignor Fred Lysing. Did you know about the accusations when you made that comment? And additionally, are there any priests or clergy that you know of right now that have been credited?
I'll answer your second part first. No, there are not. And I said honestly what I said on your radio station the other day. Father Lysing, for example, did not have a legal claim against him. We discovered a reference to the accusation while we were working through another case. And then that was mentioned in there, not as a claim, but as a fact. So we decided that while we wouldn't put him on administrative leave originally, when all of this was coming up again, it would be a good idea to take a new look at that. And there's a similar story, excuse me, for Father Ron Sajak. He was not a priest at the time of the abuse. It started in his teens. And so the review board studied that one and ruled it out as abuse of a minor. But I thought that it would be a good thing to take a new look at it. You know, this is part of my commitment to do the work in a stronger, more transparent way.
As a follow-up to what you had just said, even if there's an accusation against them when they were teenagers, doesn't that disqualify them from becoming a member of the clergy?
Well, I don't know the details at the time. I mean, that was long ago before I came. I don't know whether or not, I mean, sometimes, you know, teenagers will get involved in some experimental stuff. We've known that for years, and I don't know the file, the admissions file. Certainly, if we knew that a priest had been involved in or a candidate for the priesthood had been involved with a minor in an inappropriate way, he would never be allowed into the seminary. Not a chance.
One last question regarding this new release of priests. You had mentioned that you feel like you didn't handle it well as it pertains to allegations against, or allegations of abuse against adults. You have no list here of priests accused of abusing adults. Can you explain why?
Well, as I say, this list, as you know, at this point is a work in progress. And so we're certainly considering other categories. For example, there are a tiny handful of deacons, okay, and a few women religious sisters. And that's on our agenda. But we know that the most important and pressing concern, I think of most people, including our media friends, is the names of the priests. That's why we wanted to get these out.
Bishop Steve Brown from Channel 2. Question about the Child Victims Act, which has been circulating in Albany for a number of years. For the first time, the Conference of Catholic Bishops signaled that it could be open to a look-back provision in a piece of legislation like this. You said yesterday to Mary Alice that bankruptcy was not out of the question for the diocese.
Well, we're hoping not. And my people who are responsible for the financial resources tell me that we think it's unlikely because we have hopefully the resources to be able to handle those claims. But at this point, we don't have an absolute knowledge of what the total amount will be, because that's still under consideration by those administrators.
But wouldn't the Child Victims Act with a look-back provision mean more lawsuits against the diocese, mean more money that you'd have to spend on this issue?
Well, it possibly could.
Doesn't that mean bankruptcy is more likely if this happens?
I wouldn't be able to predict it, because we don't know, how many people will be satisfied with the claims that are coming now. And the next question probably is, did we put in the IRCP program to try to get ahead of the Child Victims Act? And the answer is no. We did that after a lot of discussion the last 2 years with all the New York bishops. We said we have to show honestly repentance and a commitment to justice and healing for the victims. And the bishops among ourselves on a telephone call said that may mean the selling of our bishops' residences and other things like that, and we all agreed we had to do it.
That would mean that it would be a really large coincidence that I think it's 6 different dioceses over the course of the last 3 years all decided to do this all at once. And the first one, Albany, did it back in 2002.
Yeah.
So this is just a coincidence?
Well, it happened. I wouldn't say it's a coincidence, but I would say that some of the downstate bishops, I don't want to name which ones, but they became very passionate about a spiritual, I remember the phone call, a spiritual responsibility that we bishops had to reach out in an effective way beyond simply words to victims.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Cheektowaga, Buffalo News. I'd first like to just ask for a clarification on the 191 claims. Are those to the IRCP program, or are those just...
These are the people who know those numbers. They live with them every day. Excuse me.
Thanks, Jay. Sorry. Just to clarify, and I got to clarify another thing, but I'll do yours first. The 191, the diocese is obligated to do this audit every year. And up until this year, it's all been claims that came in through Jackie Joy or previous victim assistance coordinators. And this year, some people bypassed that. They said, I'm not interested in talking to counseling. I don't want to hear. I'm just filing my claim against you and serving it. So what we tried to do is say, okay, who did both and who did just one, and to the best we could, get a number that, because those, even though they didn't come in as a complaint, I think that's a new allegation of child abuse. If we're hearing about it for the first time, even though it's old, it's a new claim if we've never heard from this person before. So it is both the claims that came in through Jackie and a subset of the IRCP claims that were coming to us for the first time. We were trying to catch everything that is a first-time reporter this year. Does that answer the question?
Do you have a separate number just for the IRCP claims?
There is a separate number. I don't know it.
It's still fluid. We have one coming yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, we had a deadline of June 1st for the IRCP claims, and they continue to come in. You know, people are just filing the claim. So there is a number, Jay, I just don't know it. But I want to correct something just that the bishop said about Father Sajak. The review board did consider the decision not to publicly announce Father Sajak. We have not yet, the review board has not yet considered the claim because it's still being investigated, and I don't want to get into that anymore. But so the decision was that this wasn't a claim against this man when he was a priest. And someone asked, well, geez, if you're as a teenager and teenagers do something together, should that disqualify them from being a priest? And I won't be making the determination. That'll be the review board's determination. But if we get to a point, and I understand that transparency is important, and I understand that people want to look into the past of their priests, but St. Augustine, if you read his confessions, lived a life of debauchery before he became a priest. And he became a great priest and a great bishop and one of the greatest saints in the history of our church. And if we are turning away people because of a concern for something else, boy, that's not what should be happening. But that claim is going to be investigated and presented to the review board, and a determination will be made in the future on that one. So.
Let me respond just briefly to Steve Brown's question about the Child Victims Act. Ironically, if the Child Victims Act were to pass, that would mean a greater likelihood that there would be insurance coverage that would then kick in that doesn't kick in for the Independent Reconciliation and Compensation Bureau. Well, I can't predict with any certainty, but there is a likelihood that if that were to pass, it would make it less likely, not more likely, that bankruptcy would be in the future, because you would have the possibility of insurance companies stepping up to meet their obligations for those cases, because they now would become a case or a controversy. There'd now be an occurrence that would be a covered matter. So I just want to clarify that.
Just a second question, just trying to get a sense of, you probably heard from the priests this afternoon prior to coming here, just the sense of the level of attendance at Mass, donations to the church, all I mean, in some cases, I'm hearing, free fall. Can you give me a sense of that?
Well, my colleagues here with me can correct me if I didn't get it right. They had a whole range of questions and concerns, and one or two of them did mention that the collection had gone down, or people were holding back on significant contributions. But I didn't hear a whole lot of that. There was a lot of concern among them about, the meeting I had with them I consider confidential, but I can say this won't surprise you. There was a lot of concern among them for how accused priests are treated, and that it can take a long time sometimes, longer than we'd like, for those cases to be resolved and things like that. So it was a good meeting. That's why it went too long and held you guys up.
One of those accused priests is really sort of who kicked this off, and it's Father Norm Orsolitz. We've inquired with him later on if the diocese had been in contact with him. Obviously, he claimed, or he said, he acknowledged abusing probably dozens of boys. Orsolitz told me, told another person at the news, that the only inquiry from the diocese was simply to recommend that you hire a lawyer. It seems if you were trying to get to the bottom of his abuses, you would be going to him and asking him, who are these people that you abused, and then reaching out to them. Why has that?
Well, his case, a good question. His case is one of several that are now in preparation to be sent to the Vatican for their adjudication. One has already gone over there, that's Father Franzak. I signed off on 3 others today. It's a very complicated canonical process to prepare the documentation. It really has to be perfect in the information that's provided, so that when it gets to the Vatican, they don't have to say there's something missing here, send it back to us. And on these things, as in many other things, the Vatican moves kind of slowly. So the Orsolits case is in preparation to go there, and the information will be gathered for that purpose.
But in terms of finding out who those victims are, we maybe know 5 or 6, but if he's saying probably dozens, I would take him at his word.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's no effort to sort of figure out who those people are and maybe help them.
You make a good point. I'm not sure that's the case, and I'm not doubting your word, but I certainly will check into it. If it hasn't been done, it certainly will be.
Some have filed claims.
Huh?
Some have filed.
Yep, some of them have filed claims, so we do know who some of the names are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How's everybody for time? Who's there?
Getting tight.
Okay, so Charlie, or you can each keep it to one more question. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I have some space here. Just back up a little bit, please. Thanks. Okay. Bishop Malone, I'd like to ask you something. Throughout your news conference, we've been hearing in real time from a lot of the victims here, and I just want to read you something that one of the victims has to say, and I'd like you to just respond to it. Bishop Malone clearly has no idea what the heck is going on in his own diocese. You can let him know I am still waiting for his personal phone call or Bishop Grove's personal phone call for counseling offered by the diocese.
I can tell you for sure. First of all, I hope that person will call tomorrow and identify him or herself, and we'll be able to respond. Whenever we get a call or a letter from a victim, even before we look in to see whether it's valid and substantiated or passes that neither false nor frivolous low bar, immediately counseling is provided, is offered to that person. So I don't know what happened with that, but I apologize to that victim if somehow it got caught up in the bureaucracy. As we mentioned before, and we've got the numbers, there was such a flood of claims that came in. It might have fallen through the cracks, which is not an excuse, just a reason. Bishop Gross, do you want to comment on that? Could you handle those?
Right, exactly, okay.
Bishop handles most of those.
All right, as soon as the claimant or the alleged victim does go to Jackie Joy, Jackie, after, of course, speaking with the individual, getting the information on the case, forwards a copy of that to me, legal counsel. As soon as I get that information, I have to go into the archives to do the research relative to that particular priest, whether the priest is living or deceased. And as I review the actual case, so I'm acquainted with it, I immediately call that individual. As soon as I speak to the individual, number one, I validate their case and thank them for coming forward, because in some cases, these individuals have spent perhaps years keeping this information from anybody, so thank them. And sometimes even they'll say to me, I feel terrible because I've held this for 30 years and I feel terrible because maybe others were abused. No, you came forward now. That's number one. Number two, on behalf of Bishop Malone, myself, the diocese, we extend the apology to you for this inappropriate behavior of this priest. Number three, as you probably spoke with Jackie Joy, she's offered you the opportunity for counseling. Again, I offer that again because sometimes they may say no to Jackie, but again, they'll come to me and say, let me consider it. And then if there's any other pastoral care that I can offer, fine. So, I mean, we do return those calls immediately. And again, if the person has not received that call, perhaps the person didn't go through the proper channels or whatever it might be. That's news to me.
Can I? Charlie and others, could I add just a footnote too on that topic? I don't know where I saw or read this recently, but in the past week or two, there was some comment that I lack empathy for victims. Now, no one who would say that has ever sat with me in a private setting where I have met with victims. I've met with dozens of victims in Boston and in Maine and here. And often those are tearful sessions. Any victim who is asked to sit down with me or Bishop Grosh always is given that opportunity. So you'd have to be able to sit with me and watch, which will never happen because it's a very confidential setting, to see that I don't think I lack empathy. Sometimes it's a heartbreaking, always it's heartbreaking. So anyway.
So you've never avoided meeting with victims?
I don't avoid meeting with victims at all, no. I want them to call, I don't want to be ambushed either by you people or a victim, but I met a victim not long ago, and he said something about, you didn't take my phone call. I said, I don't know about that, but I don't want a phone call. I want to make an appointment. I want you to come in and sit down. And right now I'll say in front of all of you media folks here that if there are victims who wish to come and sit down with me, I'm very open to that. But I'd rather do that face-to-face than with a phone call, if it's possible. I think we have time, Kathy, for one more.
Bishop Malone, Jen Shantz from News
Yes,
4
Jen.
again. You've mentioned that there's now new protocols put in place to handle allegations of abuse of adults by clergy. But what about abuse at the hands of diocesan employees, choir directors, diocesan teachers?
Oh, yeah.
Is removing them from the workplace enough, and why are their names not released as they would be in a criminal justice setting?
Well, and I think if I heard you correctly, you said that a protocol for handling adult allegations was in place. It's not in place. That's the problem. And that's what my new task force, lay task force, is going to be developing. But it needs to cover not only clerics, but anybody who's in church employ.
Can you tell us about some of the progress that task force has made? I know it was announced several months ago.
Well, they've just organized themselves to get together to begin to move forward on it. When you see, you've seen the names of those members yet? Of the task force?
Of the task force?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And as you can see, many of them are very busy, committed professionals. So to get them all together to launch this thing, but they're very, very passionate about getting started. It was just getting them all together at one time in one place, but it's about to happen. And they know how important this is to me, because even if the U.S. bishops decide to put together such a protocol, who knows how long that could take? And I'm sure we can do it effectively in less time. And we already do have a code of conduct that applies to everybody, priests and lay people alike, to build off of. But it's more principles than procedures and protocols. And that's what I want.
Do you plan, Bishop, on ever releasing the names of diocesan teachers or choir directors who have been accused of abuse?
Well, we're thinking all of that through now. As I said, I'm not opposed to any of that. We wanted, at this point, to really get our act together on all these different categories of priests, which we've given you today. And this, I'm sure, is not the end of the list either with the diocesan priests. As if more come in and they go through the process, they'll be on the list. Okay?
We do have one more question, so final question. Thank you.
Bishop Malone, Michael Broziak, WBFO Radio. Of all the priests who have been removed from service, were any of those cases referred to law enforcement?
I'm pretty sure they were, huh? Some were.
Can you give a percentage?
Well, I can't give a percentage. Can you talk about the memorandum?
Sure. Mike, there's a memorandum of understanding that is in place, and it's been in place since, I think, 2003. What happened is I was contacted at that time by Frank Clark, who was the district attorney, and said that he wanted to meet with me to work out a protocol to report cases to the district attorney's office. Because, for better or for worse, priests are not mandated reporters. Maybe that should be changed. I said, sure. I went over and met with him and the 8 district attorneys for all the counties. We formulated a memorandum of understanding that essentially requires reporting cases that are still timely, that could still be prosecuted. That was their idea and their language, because in large measure, they didn't want a flood of cases where the hopes of the victims would be elevated when nothing could be done. So, in addition, when John Flynn became the district attorney, I called him up and said, do you want to change it, make amendments? He did. He called me back and he said, Terry, there's been a change to the statute of limitations, which I didn't know. He said, let me get back to you. I'll draft something, run it by the 8 district attorneys for each county, and you see if it's acceptable to you. That was done several months ago.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming today. If you need more clarification and information, please contact our office. This is our best effort today. We view this as an ongoing matter, so we look forward to speaking with you again, and I'd like to ask Bishop Malone to please close us in prayer. Thank you.
Gracious God, we ask your blessing upon all gathered here today, our friends in the media and my own staff. And Lord, help me and help all of us in all of our concerns and priorities always to keep victims and their healing and justice first. Help us, Lord, to repair and rebuild our church. All of this we ask in your holy name. Amen. Thank you all. Thank you.
Bishop, before you go, we know that priests were talking about your resignation.
There were two who spoke up.
Asked for your resignation?
Yes.
And you told them what?
I told them no. I intend to the best of my ability, to continue to lead the diocese through it. And if they maybe also told you at the end of my remarks when I thanked them for coming, there was a huge applause. So they're in different places on it. But it was only two, though, that spoke out. And others seemed to be very affirming. I simply asked them for a new trust in me, that working together with them, we could move the church beyond this terrible situation. So, okay? Good.
It is clear from that last question there, I believe it was our Steve Brown, that the bishop does not plan to resign. He says we will build stability to restore trust in the diocese. So it was an hour and a half long news conference there, covered an awful lot of different issues. One thing we did learn is that there's an additional list, 20 diocesan priests with substantiated claims against them with minors, and 16 religious order priests as well.
It was 90 minutes jam-packed full of information. Just some of the rank-and-file Catholics that I've heard from, their heads were kind of spinning. It was an awful lot of information to digest. We can help you with that a little bit. We have attorney Barry Covert and Mike Tahiri with us right now just to offer a little bit of feedback. Of course, gentlemen, this seemed to be dominated by the Chancery's legal defense. Give us your insight and reflections. Barry, let's start with you.
I thought it was shockingly disingenuous for the press conference to have been drawn out the way it was. There have been so many different versions now, just in the last 72 hours, different versions of how chronologies occurred, how facts occurred. I would have greatly preferred that Bishop Malone himself would have conducted the press conference. He would have addressed all the concerns. That he would have shown that he is on top of what has occurred in the past and what is going to occur in the future. With respect to my client, who is a victim, she clearly stated in her correspondence back in 1995 that the abuse began when she was 15 years old, continued when she was 16, 17. There's proof that she was employed by Father Mariansky, that she was working with him. There were photographs of that. There's never been a claim until now that there's some confusion as to how old she was when the abuse began. Even the document, the internal document that was leaked, that said that we're going to take Father Mariansky off the list of abusive priests, what the excuse in that internal memo was because we can't explain why we left him there since 1995. We knew about this since 1995. There's no claim in that document that we're confused as to how old the victim was, because there was no confusion. But that's just one of many, many examples. I thought it was a very sad and disheartening press conference because the facts just keep changing over time, and there's no affirmative representations as to what has occurred in the past. There's no additional information being brought out, only what's extracted from the church.
I did hear some conflicts with what Bishop Malone told me yesterday in that sit-down interview, which, by the way, you can watch in its entirety. It's about 40 minutes long on WGRZ.com and on our YouTube channel. But Mike Tahiri, you represent a priest who's been put on leave, and we talked earlier about how there really has been no due process for them. What are your thoughts on what you heard this afternoon?
I echo exactly what Barry Covert said. This was a very, very disappointing interview, dominated by lawyers, dominated by high praise counsel. I mean, the bishop, frankly, doesn't even pray for the priests. If I was at that meeting with him, I mean, it was very disappointing. He has no sense or command of the situation. I mean, there's certainly, he should be running this press conference. And his failure to do so and to lay it off on his lawyers is deeply troubling as a Catholic. and it demonstrates he's really not in control of the set of circumstances. I'm not confident that list is really full and accurate as it exists. We don't really know the criteria. We know what we've been told. We know they've amended the list. Mary Ansky's not on the list. I certainly am not comfortable as a Catholic, nor listening to any sense that there's going to be an improvement in the procedures to protect the priests who are placed on administrative leave.
What stood out the most to you, though, Mike? What stood out the most?
I think really what stands out to me as a practicing Catholic is the lack of sensitivity to the priests and what they're going through. I mean, when you start out in prayer, you pray for the priests. I think that wasn't done. I don't think, you know, why hasn't anybody been paid yet? The two lawyers are there. Frankly, why haven't these cases been settled? They have two judges. They know how many claims they have. They know there's insurance out there. Yet these victims who have filed complaints, who have provided documentation, still have been provided with any funds. So where are the lawyers? Where is the priest situation?
Right.
When are they going to be decided in Rome?
Right. And last question before we go to break, because we have to go to break. Barry, let me ask you. You were saying something about the memorandum of understanding, which with the DAs. What was your feeling on that? Why things aren't being sent to law enforcement?
I have always held that the original memorandum of understanding and then the one that has now been slightly amended is really just a cover-up document. It's a document to protect the DA's offices and to protect the church. Because what the document says is that and they just changed this, is that we don't have to report to the police any instances of sexual abuse beyond 5 years, because that's a statute of limitations. Why would there be some limitation? It doesn't matter that the abuse occurred 5, 7, 10 years ago. That could be used by an investigative team to find out if there's more recent abuse. It's just a very standard way of conducting an investigation. Why does there need to be a memorandum of understanding between the church and law enforcement? I assume that there's not one between any other corporation in the city of Buffalo or Western New York and law enforcement. If you are going to just simply rely upon the legal requirement of disclosure, mandatory reporting, that's a state statute. But we're talking about the Catholic Church. Isn't there a higher obligation? Forget about the state statutes. Isn't there a higher moral obligation to protect our children, to uncover abuse to our children? Why are they relying upon a memorandum of understanding that makes everybody look good? And the DA's office can say, hey, you know, it didn't come in within the memorandum of understanding. And the church can say, hey, it didn't come in within the memorandum of understanding. And so note, it doesn't get reported. That is absolutely, from the outside, that is the definition of insanity. If we're going to worry about our victims, our child victims, the most vulnerable among us, we don't need a memorandum of understanding. I know in my household what's acceptable and what's not. I know at my workplace what's acceptable and what's not. I don't need a memorandum of understanding to tell me that if I find out that there's allegations of sexual abuse, even if it's 6, 7, 10 years ago, you turn it over to law enforcement. We don't need a written document to tell us that. Why does the church need that?
There was quite a bit troubling that was said, and again, we will make an attempt to follow up on some of the gravest or the largest inconsistencies, but it was difficult if you were following along really to keep track.
And stay with us, because Mike and Barry are going to stay with us during our 5 o'clock broadcast. It'll begin in 20 minutes. We're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we're going to go back to Cheektowaga when we're going to visit with our Dave McKinley. So we'll be back right after this quick break.